Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Silverman. He is an assistant professor of political science in the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology at Carnegie Mellon University. And today we're talking about his book, Seeing Is Disbelieving: Why People Believe Misinformation in War and When They Know Better. So, Dr. Silverman, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much. Great to be here, and it's a really unique and fascinating series that you do here. So,
thank you. So let me start by asking you, perhaps just to give a little bit of background to the interview. What is misinformation, and how do you sort fact from misinformation?
yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of critical in this space to differentiate between three concepts here. One is misinformation, another disinformation, and the third fake news. So we're starting to get our definitional ducks in a row here in this literature, in this space. And misinfo really is the broadest. It means basically information, claims that are false, empirically false, regardless of their intentionality. Disinformation, right, is a subset of that is the intentionally deceptive material. And then fake news is widely seen as sort of a piece of that, further, the smallest piece of the sort of Russian nesting doll, that is intentionally deceptive information that also is meant to mimic the way news looks to an audience. So the book, I use the term misinformation in the book, which is the broadest of those, to make sure I'm encompassing everything I talk about. But I'm sure various terms will come up, and there's a bunch of different terms in the book. Yeah.
And what would you say are the main domains in society where misinformation is most present and the most pernicious?
That's a great question. I mean, it is such a cross-cutting problem and an interdisciplinary problem for different fields that it can be hard to see the full expanse there. And when I teach on it, I really get students from all sorts of areas. I think that we have to look at health and public health as one of the key areas here. When I have three sort of special topics towards the end of the course: health, climate/environment, and conflict. I mean, but you could go elections, you could go to many areas, and I think we see it cropping up in so many parts of our lives.
In the book, you focus on misinformation in the context of war. So what types of violent conflict, do you tackle in the book?
So the book is really pitched broadly. We can talk about what I empirically focus on in the cases of Pakistan, Iraq, and Syria there, but it's meant to encompass really all situations of violent armed conflict that you can encounter, because all you really need for my theory and argument, which we'll, I'm sure, talk about, to hold, is that there's sort of a variation in sort of what civilians think and their preferences and loyalties, and sort of their media diets, which of course there will be in every situation to some, in different ways. And then some are closer and actually live the conflict, and others are further and sort of watch it and through the media. And if those basic conditions hold, you have the potential for this argument.
Right. And when and why is misinformation a problem, or do you think it's always a problem?
Yeah, and I think we have to be sort of careful and responsible here. I fully embrace and welcome and tackle these sorts of challenges. I have students debate them in my course on misinfo and fake news. They have several structured debates, and one of the motions is the threat of misinformation is overblown, and come with evidence and arguments on each side. And so I don't think we should be overstating the problem. That said, I do think it is a real problem. I think we've had a sort of a bit of a pendulum there, from maybe overamplification during the COVID phase or earlier research, and then now there's maybe a pendulum swing the other way, and clearly it's in the middle. And I think you see it being especially pernicious in some areas. This circling back to your other question.
Yeah.
And I'd highlight areas like public health and like elections, and to some extent conflict, where because it's acting on the individual, right? It's a question of individual beliefs and the propagation of those. And so sort of domains in which just decentralized individual behavior is really important, like whether individuals decide to get a vaccine shot or not, or how they choose to vote. And there are some analogs in conflict, are maybe where you see it rear its head most powerfully.
And in the context of war specifically, what kinds of misinformation can we find? I mean, which aspects of war are targets of misinformation?
Yeah, I think, I think it is a real problem in war. And I think you do see, of course I do, I wrote the book on that for that reason. I think you do see some different sort of categories or buckets of it. And this isn't the primary argument in the book, but something I've just sort of observed in the context of studying it. I think there are two big ones I'd highlight. One, I think, is broadly what I would sort of call misinformation about, you could say, power and performance in war. So really, who's winning and losing, gaining and territory or retreating, stronger and weaker, and all those sorts of things. And the other one is sort of deception and manipulation about, you could say, behavior or harm/care, or victimhood, whatever you want to call it. This is really the bucket of atrocity propaganda. A lot of it, right? Where we're going to highlight and emphasize all the terrible things, and of course, many terrible things are done in war to our side, and deny them in reverse. And I think that's one way to think about it. And you see across different cases, that one of those categories is more emphasized than another. I'm happy to talk about that if you like.
Yes. And do we know if people easily fall for misinformation related to war?
That's a good question. I mean, I think certainly they do fall for misinformation, wartime misinformation, just like we are all vulnerable to all sorts of different falsehoods in our lives. I think there are some features of war that may make the problem particularly severe. The intense emotional nature of war, especially some kinds of wars, and early on, you would have to look at the powerful way media becomes a weapon that's controlled, co-opted, or biased in war, because the parties have incentives to do that. So some of the ways that war is so cognitively difficult and challenging to even navigate or accept, some of the things that are done, or the idea of it hitting your community. So I think there are some factors that may make it, add to the problem. But baseline, we should expect that there's susceptibility, just as there is susceptibility elsewhere. Though, as I argue in the book, there are some features of war that also, if you're in certain parts of it, can cut against that.
But isn't misinformation sort of commonplace in war? I mean, we many times hear about war propaganda. Shouldn't we expect it from all sides in a war?
I mean, I think so. I think that's right. I think that's a reasonable baseline expectation, that when you have these societies or communities mobilized for this extremely high stakes armed struggle, they're going to have strong incentives to engage in, to manipulate the information space and engage in strategic communications sort of warfare, as well as offline warfare. And we just saw this with the India-Pakistan conflict, where Pakistan, the Pakistani government had a sort of a ban on Twitter X usage due to an sort of extremely polarized situation in their own society, and the military not wanting supporters of the populist leader Imran Khan to be agitating on there. And they lifted it during the war, the brief war, saying we are getting blasted online and overwhelmed with India's communication power. We need to make sure we're out there advocating for our side. India and Indian nationalists were thinking similarly. So I think you see the incentives, the even admitting of those incentives, and that will happen everywhere in all conflicts.
And what are the consequences of misinformation during war? What kinds of consequences can it have?
I think it overall should be viewed as a danger, as a threat. It is generally, I think, designed to provoke and to incite. Certainly, the atrocity, the second category I highlighted, all the atrocity propaganda, is to enrage and incite and mobilize your followers and other audiences who can support you. And so from there, we can think about how it can lead to greater support for wartime combatants, contributions in various ways, even people participating in violence. And I think some of the, I think it's an issue across wars, but sometimes when there's sort of communal mass violence is when it can be really dangerous, because I was sort of earlier saying, when you have individual decentralized behavior, that's when people's beliefs can easily translate into action. So when you're looking at ethnic mob riots in India or Sri Lanka or wherever, maybe that's where you can even see it more directly precipitating violence. But I think contributing to wars lengthening and intensifying, you can see many cases.
Do we have a good understanding of the extent to which wartime misinformation might translate into actual behaviors, like wars getting started or sparking more violence, or people participating in wars and other kinds of social conflict?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I like how you phrased that, just asking us, do we have that understanding? What do we know? I mean, I do think that is that we can, first of all, I should say, I mean, we can see their connections and contributions there. That first of all, we should think theoretically that there's a reason that wartime actors, combatants go to such lengths to manipulate public perceptions of the facts on the ground about pain and suffering and who's doing what. So just off the bat there, there's should privilege us, or push us to think that there's value there. And I think then that also theoretically, if you're creating grievances, that's one of the most central things in conflict. If you're facilitating and entrenching people's grievances towards each other, we have a lot of then research on how that matters. I think in terms of specifically like hard research showing the consequences of misinformation, I think that's one of the areas that is that there should absolutely be more work. That's one of the hardest things to demonstrate, to independently show what a misinformation narrative, how it changes behavior in any sphere. and I think some folks are working on it. But I think we can look at some cases and really a detailed understanding of cases, whether that is the U.S. drone campaign in Pakistan, which we might talk about, or that's Nazi propaganda and misinformation in World War II. And I think we can all there flesh out a pretty compelling story about how some of this has mattered too.
Yeah. By the way, before we delve into the main argument of your book, when it comes to wartime misinformation, has there been lots of work done on it for a long time, or is it something more recent?
Well, I certainly thought there was an opening there, and I think that's right. I mean, I think there's been I saw these as these two sort of ships, these big ships that were out there on the water. There's this vast body of work on conflict, and especially kind of increasingly on the sort of ground level dynamics of conflict, and even individual, a lot of public opinion work now on conflict and how sort of people really think in such situations. And on the other hand, there's there had been a really blowing up this body of research on misinformation. I hadn't seen the collision of those very much. There are a couple of articles that had come out, but there hadn't really been a real serious social science book that I'd seen trying to really focus in on and tackle that problem. Certainly, there's a lot that I have to say I built on. There's old work on wartime propaganda. There's work in by people who are journalists and people in communications on media and war and propaganda and war. So, but on this, trying to really theorize and analyze belief in misinformation in war in a more protracted way, at a book length way. I think there was not that much on that.
And why do you think that's the case?
I mean, I think sort of misinformation studies had only sort of blown up, some years earlier with Trump's election and Brexit and then COVID. So, that was only emerging. There had been, of course, studies of conspiracy theories for years in psychology, but, so that was picking up steam. At the same time, people were increasingly sort of digging into that micro level of conflict because they had the tools to do so more in the last couple decades to get really rich data from conflict at the individual level. And so I think there were some methods reasons and some new theory things that were coming out, and but I hadn't seen them fully collide there yet.
Right. So let's the main argument of your book then. Do we know which factors contribute to people's susceptibility to embracing misinformation in war?
Well, I certainly hope so. I hone in on two key sort of pieces. So one is motivation, what I call motivation, and the other is information. I think these do build on two of the big branches of what influences people's sort of factual beliefs and beliefs in misinformation in general. And there are other branches, and I can get to those if you like. But how I see them playing out here, when I say motivation, what I mean is sort of how you approach new information. What's your psychological motivation when you do so? And there's a lot of work on how people have often sort of engage in that through a motivated reasoning lens. And often we want to protect and entrench and reinforce our identities. There's something called IPC, identity protective cognition. In the US, it's often partisan identities, a lot of research on this, or it can be racial or ethnic identities. And so we often approach this from new info in a biased way, and try to align it with our our factual beliefs and select our information sources as well to do so. And yet, I think all that research is right, is important, and yet it has somewhat forgotten a little bit of a piece of its roots in the classic social psychology side, where a motivated bias or a directional motive was always the term, was contrasted with having an accuracy motive, which means that yes, we sometimes have biases of various strength, but we can also have a desire to really get it right. And the sort of classic theory there was that when the stakes are raised for us of the issue or topic or situation, we'll often engage in a more thorough search for information and a more objective and even-handed processing of it. And that's been shown in the lab. And so the application of that here is to say that with misinformation in something like war, yes, we have these loyalties and attitudes in conflict. If we're in a situation in a conflict, we may, like in Syria, support the rebels or the regime more, or other actors, or maybe that there's bombing done by an outside power that's, maybe it's detested, and a civilian thinks that power has, sort of sinister motives. And so we'll have a motivated bias, that person will, to believe that the actual events and what happened matched their perception of the actor, right? And that the motivation that they think the actor had, that maybe the bombing was indiscriminate. And yet there's an accuracy motive that kicks in, and I argue when people are really experiencing war, because there's tremendous variation in that of, war is so mediatized and social mediatized with millions of people viewing it now, for good and ill. And yet there's these frontline populations that really live with the horrors of war, in Eastern Ukraine and Gaza and in Iraq, wherever it is. And, I'm talking about not just countries, but swaths of countries, areas, communities, villages. And they will have a powerful manifestation of this accuracy motivation to say, because why? Their lives can depend on it, their welfare. They need to know, should we flee this bombing or not? Should I, try to give information to the state authorities against the Islamic State in my villages? Is there an opportunity to do that? What's the Islamic State doing to us? Is that true or not? What are the beliefs? What are my understanding of the state's behavior towards it? And so when they have a more powerful accuracy motive to really make sure they have as much as they can a grasp of that information about what's happening around in their community. So that can create a cleavage. And then informationally, I argue you get a reinforcement of that, because of course we can have informational biases of all sorts. And the media, as I said, can really be a weapon in war. And so we all have our biased media spheres we can fall into, and in war, of course, the same. But for those frontline populaces, they will also be able to get more accurate and direct and local information relatively, because they are closer to the scene of the crime, and information spreads horizontally via word of mouth and communal accumulated knowledge as well. And so both of these kind of align. And there's one thing we can talk about where it's a two-pronged theory. It can be hard to split those mechanisms, but they both align, and they kind of can create this powerful gap where these sort of exposed communities both have the greater means and motives to know what's happening in war, and the opposite's true with people that are removed, who are a really powerful, of course, audience and various audiences in conflict too. So that leads to the ultimate conclusion of the book, Seeing Is Disbelieving. And it's not the only dimension here, but I think it's a really important one.
So do the media themselves then contribute to these informational biases?
Yeah, they absolutely do. I mean, we shouldn't take that as just this fixed thing. One way of thinking about it is, I'm not saying that people who are removed from war will automatically be brainwashed. They will just be susceptible. There will be more room or space for all of the sort of factual distortions and biases that we have in our lives about the events. So, it will depend on the direction of the bias, the media's bias, and their own orientation. But if those things push them to be biased about what's happening in a conflict, they can certainly fall prey to it.
And on the more motivational side of things, which kinds of motivations can people have that make them understand the information more accurately or not?
Well, I think it's really this survival motive that is very powerful and unique to these communities in war. I mean, it's an accuracy drive in general, but it's like a powerful version of it. And you can see glimmers of this. I mean, we all experience it to some extent. When we get anxious, about something, it can be that we need to desperately search for some information about, or let's say something we don't understand that we're going to teach or do in an interview. Or there's just a feeling of threat. And so, oh my God, there's going to be these tariffs, or there was this incident that happened, these crimes, or possibly even a terrorist attack. I need to know something about that. I need to know this information. And, that's a sort of anxiety-based learning. I'm forgetting the name of the theoretical model. Affective. Forget that one. I'll have to get back to you about that. But that's a key idea in sort of how we learn. And so when there's that same process can occur, I think, even more powerfully in war, when your survival is at stake, when the lives of you yourself and your family are on the line, you're going to be pretty unflinching in your desire to make sure you can understand the threats. And you can look at people, and there's some amazing quotes in all sorts of conflicts. I remember one from the Blitz in Britain, where it was I think a secret British intelligence report noting that because early on with the Blitz, the Nazis scored some sort of successes in hitting British cities, and the British government was sort of concealing and covering up the extent of the damage, and sort of projecting this stiff upper lip mentality. And the intelligence report was saying there's demand for more true and accurate information. So people were, even though there was this great threat, they wanted to know more. There was an accuracy search. And then the same way you can look in, maybe in U.S. Pakistan drone case, they're the people in the Northwest Territories that really experienced that. There were some amazing or striking quotes as well, talking about how it's so different if it's a lived experience for them, and that it affects their day-to-day decision-making, and these sort of broad moral narratives about it being a sovereignty violation and sort of a continuation of U.S. aggression and this and that, which we could debate. They might be right morally, but they don't think about that morally that way. And so there's this quote about how they only get sort of a wounded smile from a tribesman who has to live thinking about this in their daily choices.
Mm-hmm. So let me just ask you a little bit about methodology here before we get into a few examples of war conflicts that you explore in the book. So empirically, how do you study people's factual beliefs and biases in war? What kinds of methodological approaches are there?
Yeah, great question. I think that the book, you have to get to the micro level for sure with this. You're studying populations, individuals, and their perceptions and beliefs. So the tools that we have to do that, you can look at qualitative and quantitative tools. Quantitatively, talking about public opinion surveys and maybe survey experiments. And the book does deploy, there's a lot of opinion data that I try to pack in there, from existing sources like Pew, bringing, just so we have some context and descriptive understanding of attitudes in somewhere like Pakistan. And then some surveys that I was able to get my hands on myself or fielded myself. And then, so you have that sort of quantitative side, and then, qualitatively, there's interviews and focus groups and other things. And the book uses some interviews that were done in Syria. They were actually, thankfully, made available to me by a colleague who did them and used them in his book, a couple hundred interviews with Syrian refugees in Turkey, for a really more dense qualitative picture. So both of those really useful. It is I think mixed methods can be powerful here. And then I'd say lastly that you also should just have a deep and well-rounded, hopefully qualitative knowledge of the context. And you should really try to know the anecdotal empirical record. Which is, I think, a term that another scholar, Stathis Kalivas, uses, who's a noted conflict scholar. I don't know if you've interviewed him. Did you interview Stathis?
No.
Okay, you've interviewed so many great people, and I think a number of prolific conflict scholars, that you should be sort of hopefully dripping with that knowledge that you can use to really flesh out and breathe life into your theories too.
So let's illustrate all of what we've been talking about here with some examples of war conflict. So could you tell us about the example of the US drone campaign in the tribal regions of Pakistan?
Yes, absolutely. This became a key case in the book. It was sort of happenstance, but I wound up being connected and embedded with, I was interested in the broader Middle East and Islamic world with Pakistani communities in the US, and then traveling to Pakistan and have some close collaborators there who helped. And, it's a situation that was salient, at the time I was writing. There were these debates about the US drone campaign in Pakistan, and was there blowback or not, these terms. And I started to realize there was just tremendous variation in Pakistani perceptions of what was happening, and even sort of factual perceptions. And so what are the facts? First of all, this became sort of an extension of the Afghan war. It was, started where militant groups that were sort of based in or were getting some sanctuary in the tribal regions of Pakistan. Pakistan's a large, diverse country of 250 million people, but there's just one slice of it called the Northwest Territories, the tribal regions of Pakistan, and it's commonly referred to as FATA. So the federally administered tribal areas, and it's sort of these borderlands, this one small slice of Pakistan on the Afghan border, and it's long been relatively ungoverned and volatile, and had significant challenges with Islamist militancy. And some groups like the Pakistani Taliban, as well as some of the groups really active in Afghanistan, were heavily based there. And so through the course of this war and the Bush, and then, perhaps even more so the Obama years, there came to be this significant U.S. Use of armed drones, unmanned vehicles, as one of the ways, along with the Pakistani military operations too, to sort of, in their view, try to meet this challenge and target the militant key leaders and degrade these groups that were, key to destabilizing Afghanistan and Pakistan to a degree. And so, we can have all sorts of discussions and debates about this, as well as sort of broader use of drone warfare. I'm, in fact, not taking moral positions on that. What I'm looking at is this question of factually what happened, and then, perceptions and misperceptions around that in Pakistan. And it became a really salient issue in Pakistani society. Of course, understandably, there's a lot of suspicion and I think what word to use best here. mistrust and baggage towards the U.S. in Pakistan as a result of U.S. foreign policy towards the country over decades, and towards Afghanistan and so on. And so and there came to be a real sort of explosion of protests, hundreds, if not thousands, of protests against these drones during the height of the campaign. And ultimately, and some of them became, sort of armed or violent protests. There were a number of attacks stopping. Pakistan was sort of the key supply route to Afghanistan from the Pakistani ports in the south of the country. Ultimately, that had to be rerouted so that it went more expensively through Central Asia. And so the U.S. scaled back its presence in Pakistan. There were some other flashpoints too, but the drone campaign, the use of Pakistani territory for it, and the killings in the tribal regions became a political flashpoint, and ultimately were one factor that helped elect the gentleman I mentioned earlier, Imran Khan, who's played a key role and still does in current Pakistani politics. So politically influential. The key with the misperceptions is that, in fact, in this case, in despite what we might say about them in other ways, that they were a relatively targeted and low civilian casualty compared to militants' instantiation of political violence in the tribal regions. And that's not what people would have believed. You can imagine how their motivated biases, how their media environment would have pushed them in the other direction. With all the things the U.S. has done in Pakistan and Afghanistan, most Pakistanis would have been easy to believe and easy for elites to whip up a sentiment that they're indiscriminate death machines and scourges killing scores of civilians all the time. And there were mistakes, but by and large, that's not true. And there's evidence from WikiLeaks where Pakistani officials admit that that's not true. There's various forms. There's even some public admissions that are a few things as the campaign bore on. And of course, most people from the tribal areas do not think that is true and know that that is not true. And that's key here. If you actually listen and speak to them, they will say, look, we're no friend of the U.S., but mostly that was targeting the key militants. And there were some mistakes, and they were annoying and disruptive. They sometimes have a term referring to them as insects, but they were not causing mass civilian deaths. And it was the Pakistani army's heavy-handed military campaigns, dropping heavy bombs on villages and having operations that cleared areas. And it was the Pakistani Taliban's use of terror and efforts to coercively control their society that they knew comparatively were much more indiscriminate in nature. And now there are even some pretty rigorous research studies. At first, this was sort of a hypothesis, and you could hear different things. But by now, the best, and there were some NGOs that had, I think, a political motive pushing back on it. There are now multiple research studies, the best research studies, not by me, but by Pakistani political scientists, two of them interviewing hundreds of people who were displaced from the tribal areas. One by a gentleman named Akil Shah, that's published, and there are public pieces in the Washington Post and elsewhere, and another by a female scholar, Neha Ansari, who, last I checked, was a doctoral student at Harvard, may have graduated, has also written about this, and I think it's a part of her dissertation work. So, and various others in the country, journalists and scholars. And really, when you look at this whole ball of evidence and this whole understanding of what goes on there, it's quite clear that there is this gap, a powerful gap, where the local population is thinking very differently than this broader population that was mobilized against the campaign. And so it's just a very clear and fascinating and powerful case of that sort of proximity-based belief situation.
Mhm. How about the Syrian civil war? How have the sorts of phenomena we talked about here manifested there?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that one. The other case was Iraq, and it points in a similar direction, a little more quantitatively. I wound up studying that one. And then I was very lucky and fortunate to be able to get my hands on some data and information that let me dig into the case in Syria, because it's such a different case. It's Iraq and Pakistan. When people see what I looked at and analyzed there, and it was sort of happenstance in a way, they say, oh, well, you're just looking at sort of this U.S. violence, and people's perceptions about that maybe being overblown, and that can lead to some sort of questions and how is this really a general? Syria is so different. It's a many-sided civil war. It was thankfully ended recently. It was not heavily about the U.S. and an anti-U.S. insurgency, and there were all sorts of misbeliefs that I was able to look at. I was thankfully, I think I mentioned, able to get my hands on a couple hundred really rich interviews done by a great scholar, Justin Schoen, and for his book, Surviving the War in Syria. He asked really about their detailed choices during the war, about their migration paths. He was interested, among other things. But he crucially did ask several questions about their belief in rumors. And he wrote a nice piece on this, but I felt like there was more to mine and more to exploit. So I asked him for that. A colleague and collaborator and friend, he was happy to give them to me. And I sort of mined those transcripts qualitatively and quantitatively. And I was able to get info on people's, really paint a picture of what rumors they believed in Syria. And there were all sorts of rumors believed, rumors about Assad's death constantly cropping up. And many people knew those were false, but there was manipulation about which sides were winning, people hiding atrocities, and it's harrowing stuff sometimes. But you see glimmers of people who are more exposed. Of course, you can see this in the text qualitatively, saying that the regime told us that there was no massacre, but I went to the square and I saw the bodies in the trees and all these horrible things. But you see how people who really are there and are seeing things, and they know over time that the media is going to be lying to them, and they have these bases from which to form more accurate and informed beliefs. And then quantitatively, he had a key question saying, how confident are you in your ability to discern fact or whether rumors were true and false? And I show, it's a couple hundred people, but there's very suggestive and I think nicely supportive, complementary with the other piece of the book, relationships showing that people who were in Syria longer, people who said they saw more different types of violence, all these things really strongly correlate with people saying they are more confident, have a greater discernment ability in the war. And so it sort of paints this different picture, I think, that helps, I hope, flesh out what is going on and show it applies in a lot of different situations and to a lot of different rumors and types of misinfo.
Can you comment on what's been happening in Ukraine and Gaza? I mean, these are probably the most prominent, or if not prominent, at least the ones that are the two armed conflicts that are the most salient on the news right now. So do we see similar phenomena playing out there?
Of course. And it depends how much time you have in terms of trying to comment on those. You could have long discussions of each. And I was making a face as you were doing that because they're both tragic situations. But I think you do see these dynamics. Sort of manipulation of facts and misinformation has been powerful in both. And it was striking to me, I remember, and I wrote about this, I think, in the book's preface, because I was like completing this book that I'd started on these other conflicts way earlier. And I was like, wow, this is really powerful, what's happening, and very emotional. And I'm connected to some of those conflicts. And I was like, it was pretty wild to see all the people, and even myself sometimes believe, being susceptible to misinfo, but also at the same time seeing some of those limits. So I mean, in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I think there's been misinformation on both sides, but much more on by the Russian side. There is something to that, by the way, in terms of the variation in which side pours out more misinfo. I think you asked, or you sort of got maybe a question about this earlier. I think that the parties and the combatants in war that have more to hide in terms of are committing more atrocities and also maybe are not performing as well are where you will see more factual manipulation. And so Russia's poured out plenty of that about the alleged Nazis and Nazification of Ukraine and the leadership and all this, as well as hiding some of their setbacks and defeats and some of the atrocity. They've had atrocity propaganda going back years in Ukraine. The quote unquote crucified boy was something that they pushed in the Donbass war in 2014-15 on our what's the channel? One of the state TV channels, Russia One, was it? Claiming that there was a boy, a Russian-speaking boy in eastern Ukraine who'd been literally crucified by Ukrainian soldiers, and it turned out to be totally false, and there was a whole scandal and apology and everything. And so, there clearly is this mess of propaganda pushed by Russia and some a little bit by Ukraine too, but you see that it's not been very effective and influential on Ukrainians, including especially I think Eastern Ukrainians and Ukrainians in the contested areas, where there are really striking quotes saying when you're bombed, it changes your mind about things, and those would be some of the populations that might have not been as much slamming the door in some ways on Russia in the past due to some more linguistic and ethnic and other ties. So that's a sensitive issue. Of course, they're part of the Ukrainian community, but I think we see some of that falling flat, and two, we see it falling flat with Russian soldiers. That's another area. It's not all just civilians and people debunking things on social media, but soldiers are, in a way, this also population that experiences war, and there's variability there in how much what they see and how indoctrinated they are. But you get all these stories of Russian soldiers, and I view many of them as victims too, thrown into this meat grinder, saying this isn't what we were sent to do. We realized as soon as we got there, there was this population with bristling hostility to us, and we weren't liberators. And their New York Times had some intercepted calls from Russian soldiers back home saying, "Mom, this is horrible. We don't know what we're doing here." And so that's part of the reason Putin has had such a vicious clampdown on soldiers, political maybe propagation and activity back home. There's an NGO called the Committee for the Union of Soldiers' Mothers that has been historically active in Russia. If not, he's either disbanded it or suppressed it. And I think they represent one of the real ways, along with maybe ethnic ties between Ukrainians and Russians. Many of them have family, and they call each other, even still to this day through the war. And so there are ways through which the information spreads back into Russia. And you can see Putin trying and the Kremlin clamp down on that. And we could talk about the handful of Ukrainian stories and conspiracy theories too. There's not been no misinformation on that side. But you can see some of that happening, even as it's not really one. Happy to talk about Gaza too. Of course, a terribly ugly, tragic conflict. And I think you have misinfo and conspiracy theories and hate speech and all the other informational bads on all sides. I will say both of these are sort of interstate conflicts, in my view. Israel-Gaza is a difficult one, but you don't, in part of what it's civil war, you do have these population mixing more, and you get a little bit more a little less scope for what I'm talking about in like Israel, Gaza, because it's all self-reinforcing, right? For Israelis, they saw this horrible atrocity on October 7th, and then their media, of course, and they had this trauma, historical trauma, maybe it built on, and then their media environment sort of ran with that, and so that's all sort of the motivated biases, and the media biases will reinforce the real events, and so you don't have, there is some of this proximity thing, I think, in Israel based on soldiers, some of them, what they have seen in Gaza, as well as hostages, what some of the hostages have seen, and some of their dissent, saying, what are you doing? You're bombing us, and we see what you're doing, and some of their agitation against the Bibi Netanyahu government. But it's a little more of that mutually reinforcing set of issues. Of course, you can see plenty of misinformation about what they've done in Gaza, and there's a lot they're trying to conceal and hide from the international community, as well as maybe even their own audiences, and all this stuff about Hollywood and saying they're crisis actors. Any narrative basically ever historically where you say that there's crisis actors is pretty much should baseline be viewed as false, because crisis actors means, the term?
Yes.
Right? That there's sort of actors pretending to actually be suffering in a war or an emergency situation. It suggests that there's a false flag attack, and historically false flags are extremely hard to pull off and very rarely done. Hitler tried them against Poland and all sorts of things, and so they're almost always the fodder of conspiracy theories and not reality, Sandy Hook and this and that. So on the other side, there I think it's very sensitive and politically contentious, but there is misinformation as well, and fake news. There's a powerful international constituencies that are activated and mobilized about what's happened on both the Israeli and Palestinian sides. There are claims that 10/7 was an inside job, or that they're crisis actors, and there's in these videos of the kids crying about their killed parents, and so I mean that's misinformation too. And there's extreme versions of what happened about sexual violence and this and that, that we'd have to look at as also fed by motivated and media biases. And the other one, I think the one where you can see the argument holding well, maybe best, is, and it's really hard to know, and we should have humility and uncertainty about this, is public opinion within Gaza. I think, though, there are some pretty strong indications that Gazans have a sort of a pox on both your houses mentality, many of them, which happens pretty commonly in war. There's a study of the Syrian civil war about what happens when the Syrian regime uses barrel bombing on its population. Of course, one of the worst tactics you can do in war. You'd expect it to generate immense animosity against the regime, and the authors find, with a very clever design, that it created anger at both the regime and the rebels for their inability, their provoking of the regime, bringing the wrath of the regime down on these communities with an inability to protect them from that. And that's a common theme you see in war in Chechnya and elsewhere. And so I think you see that quite clearly in Gaza, where of course, there's tremendous anger and hate about what Israel has done, but there's no love lost and quite a bit of anger about what Hamas has done too, with a real understanding, motivated understanding of reality, because the lived reality and experienced reality of what many of them have felt, where Hamas hasn't been able to protect them. They provoked Israel to, and then kind of hid selfishly in the shadows. And I do think there's really strong glimmers in various Arab writers, Hussein Ibish and others, many others, and sort of detailed media investigations of this show that, as well as even public opinion patterns, that even the polling's hard to do now, but it suggests Hamas popularity is down in Gaza, up in the West Bank, where the experiences have been very different. And I think, so you do see some powerful ways. Israel-Palestine is maybe a tricky case with some mutually reinforcing bubbles and biases, but that this does play out in that case. as difficult as it is for us to accept. And I think it leads to the conclusions and implications of the book, which is hard as it is for us to do. We have to try to look at and lift up these voices of these communities that actually experience the horrors and the complexities, and not just our own video game sensations of what we want to happen and which side we support.
So finally, I would like to ask you just a couple of questions about what we can do with the knowledge you present in your book. So can we learn something new about topics such as the duration of armed conflicts, the feasibility of prevailing counterinsurgency models, and the depths and limits of misperceptions more broadly in social and political life?
Yeah, I think so. I hope so, certainly. And there's several bits there. I'll try my best to talk about them. Those are really some of the things I tried to run with in the book's conclusion. As far as implications for conflict, I think we can see how this model does impact things like the duration of war, yes, and things like counterinsurgency. So take war duration. What I tried to get at there is that there will be this gap very often between the local populations that have experienced the costs and fully recognize them of war and the more removed populations that don't. And then you can imagine the strength and size of those two constituencies can vary. In particular, where you have powerful diasporas, it is one reason why you can see how war can be perpetuated by those diasporas who will be not experiencing. If you're aggrieved about what's happening but removed from it, that's where you'll be most susceptible to that factual manipulation towards your side. And so diasporas can be a big part of that, maybe areas with small conflict zones but large external sympathetic communities. And so I think it shines a light on some ways in which war is likely to be maybe perpetuated longer in new ways. And counterinsurgency, I think it speaks to, maybe that's a hopeful, in some ways, faded term now, counterinsurgency, at least as it was such a hot topic of study in Western circles, maybe during the post 9/11 wars. But I think there were these models that had some merit, and they were backed up by some rigorous research about how, about sort of winning hearts and minds and at the local level, and showing that various kinds of actions, avoiding too much collateral damage or providing services and payments to local communities was pretty effective empirically in gaining more support and tamping down violence in some of these conflict zones like Iraq and Afghanistan and the Philippines and elsewhere, not all the US-based ones. And there's some rigorous sort of econ and poli-sci research on that, but it was very local. It was always very localized. And I do think it's real, but we have to reckon with the fact that those are the communities where those carrots and sticks are being used. They're being recognized accurately, those signals. And that's why we get the expected behavioral consequences. If you then have media broadcasting those much more broadly, you can have the exact opposite thing happening at the same time. And that's what we see in a case like Pakistan, where the best, I think, empirical research suggests that the US drone campaign was locally effective. Not just that it was pretty targeted, but in this case, in Pakistan, it was pretty locally effective in, tamping down militancy, within these tribal agencies. Very small part of Pakistan. At the same time, I would venture to say it was fairly counterproductive nationally and maybe internationally, and because partially of misperceptions, feeding a very anti-drone politics. And so I think you're going to have both at the same time, and it points towards some of the limits and ways we should be pretty cautious about this sort of very rationalist counterinsurgency models that people think can work. Those are two implications for conflict and conflict theories. I think there are others, and we should think about this local national gap. But what I wanted to get to is sort of, okay, what do we do about all this? What does it lead us or suggest that maybe we should do? I mean, it's a very hard problem. I'm not saying we're going to get out there and fix it immediately, but it does, I think, point towards a little bit of a solution set or like a set of strategies to try to mitigate things, which is that this local, non-local gap can be not just a problem, but a possible solution, because it suggests that if you can elevate and amplify the volume of these frontline populations, which are purveyors of truth relatively, towards relative to the screaming audiences thousands of miles away that have strong passions but little experience, you can hopefully rebalance things. Now, there are forces pushing against that, but I think there are some interesting possible strategies to do so. For example, social media platforms, and I recognize fully that there's a retreat of social media platforms wanting to do any interventions to shape the information environment, but they could flag or label sort of local or frontline sources in a conflict. They even experimented with this. Twitter, at the time it was Twitter, not X, under Jack Dorsey, did have sort of, I forget what they called, on-the-ground lists maybe. You could follow in Ukraine with local journalists and other influencers and who were maybe a little bit vetted. And because the platforms have the geolocations of all these people. You don't have that publicly. I don't have that as a researcher, but they know. And so, we could talk about the mechanics of that, but they could maybe vet or verify people and have some method of even algorithmically labeling people so that we got an ability to know who was really a local source in conflict. Now, again, maybe we're pessimistic about platforms' desire to do any of that. I would argue, if I were in the room with any higher ups on the major social media platforms, that is an information adding intervention, and it's pretty light touch, but still. So I think there are some creative ways of things we can do. And then broadly, lastly, I'd say I do think the model should hopefully be looked at and extrapolated back towards other areas of misperception and misinformation. I was studying this case, this context, and I think it was maybe an understudied context of factual manipulation and misperception in war that had some distinctive features, but you can see maybe how some of the pieces of that hadn't, I think, been as honed in on there are strong parallels and echoes elsewhere. So, anywhere where there's high stakes stimuli that people are closer to, whether that's disease or pollution or crime or whatever, you have the potential for this local accuracy advantage. Now, I do think, and there's other research looking at this. There's some research. I'm trying to put the pieces together and say this can hold. Now, I do think that it will depend on how publicly visible it is, as well as its cost. Because war, a lot of what's happening, we're talking about people moving here and there and shooting and killing and torturing each other and all these horrible things, and lies about it. But some of this stuff is out of view. So, or it's about science. So it's very hard for people to see the germ theory of disease, or it's very hard for people to see the greenhouse effect. Now, that means that people will, who are closer, will have a better knowledge of what is happening descriptively, that their areas are flooding or burning or shrinking or getting sick. And so this kind of dynamic will apply to that, but not maybe on the causal side. It depends there. So I think there's some really interesting threads. I tried to start to unravel for others there to think about when this sort of kind of sharp constraint based on people needing to know can sort of apply in a lot of areas.
One final question then. Do you think that this knowledge could have also policy implications?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess that's what I was trying to, some of what I was trying to get towards, although it depends what you call a policy implication, is that, understanding, this landscape of who's likely to be factually manipulated in conflict, I do think is important because it influences behavior, can influence behavior. So, parties in conflict that we may view as, having we may be sympathetic towards should try to navigate that effectively, or maybe the international community or UN or others that are trying to sort of stabilize conflicts need to be aware of this, ready to sort of counter, ready to target the communities that are most susceptible based on this theory, which are those that are removed but aggrieved, rather than leafleting and pamphleting and radioing and all the frontline communities that already often know. So I think there is some of that. I think some of the other policy implications, like I just talked about, like being a little more cautious and pessimistic about some of these interventionist models that sort of apply best locally. And I think that stuff I was talking about with the platforms depends whether you call that a policy implication, but there are some ways to try to lift up local voices, and other things related to that too. Like I think I have great respect and admiration for the leading like open source investigative organizations, OSINT organizations, like Bellingcat, and fact-checking organizations like Alt News in India or many others around the world. And all the work that they do, which now is really, some of the funding, if they were getting funds from Meta and elsewhere, is dried up. But that stuff and supporting it, looking to it, as well as these local populations that is part of what feeds it. I think all of that is important.
Great. So the book is again Seeing Is Disbelieving: Why People Believe Misinformation in War and When They Know Better. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Silverman, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. You can always look me up. Have my website, personal website. Was it DanielMSilverman.com, I believe, or my page at CMU, and I am active on social media, perhaps unwisely. I was on Twitter/X, and I have accounts on all the sites, but I post on Blue Sky a little more now, and so, but I continue to work on all these problems and others, and thank you for interviewing me. I look forward to any engagement.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a big pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sundo, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Asteri, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.